I guess we know it's in progress now. Our presenter is David Peterson, as Elizabeth said, a Seattle-based historic resource consultant who prepared the Seattle landmark nomination on the property. The story he'll share is about more than the Cettolin House, in that it includes an effort to stop Sound Transit's expansion to West Seattle, parentheses, which threatened dozens of business buildings in addition to the Cettolin House and other nearby homes. As mentioned before, David is a Seattle-based historic resource consultant with a degree in agriculture from the University of Washington. He has 20 years of he has 20 years of experience researching and analyzing historic properties. He's a member. Is that what Elizabeth just read? I'm sorry. He's a member of the Society of Architectural Historians, Historic Seattle, Vernacular Architecture Forum, and a board member of the Washington Courts Historical Society. David, what does DoCoMoMo-WeWa, and what do you do with them?
It's an all-volunteer group. It's actually an international group based in the Netherlands, and it is interested in documenting modern architecture. So it's people that are interested in mid-century buildings all over the country and all over the world.
Well, it was in your bio and I wanted to ask. So thank you for that. And thank you for being willing to tell this story to our audience. So we're all ears. It's all yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen, and this is new to me.
There we are.
Okay, can you see that? Does that work?
It looks good, yes.
Okay, thank you. So as Dorothy said, I'm a historic resource consultant in Seattle, and what I'm presenting tonight is essentially the presentation that I made for the landmark, the Fausto and Irma Cettolin House, and it's a little bit abbreviated. So it's a really interesting house because it's a vernacular house that represents the Fausto Cettolin, who was the owner and the builder. It took him 13 years to build it, 1926 to 1939, and it reflects his experience. It harkens back to the types of houses that were being built in the early 20th century in Italy. And so it's an unusual example of a guy from another country building a house that looks like the place where he came from. And you would think that would be more common, but it's actually not. And I'll get to more of that in a bit. Fausto and Irma, I want to talk a little bit about how we know so much about this house. These are some great images. Fausto and Irma in the lower right image, and then Fausto is in the upper image with 3 of his children. They had 6 children. And this is, we have an amazing amount of historic photos of the house. Next slide is in the upper right are the 6 children of Fausto and Irma. And then the inset photo, the black and white inset photo, is them when they were very young and when they were living in this house. At the upper left is Virginia Cettolin between her parents, Irma and Fausto. She's also known as Sister Mary Cabrini, and she's the youngest daughter. And she met the current owners of the house, Alan McMurray and Marilyn Kennel in the lower right, and knocked on their door and said, "This is the house I grew up in. Can I come take a look?" And this was several years ago, but they've come to be fast friends. And Virginia was able to provide, she lives up in Blaine, Washington, and she was able to provide all of these photos, these family photos that help document and explain this house, because it's an odd house. And if you've ever walked past it, it has this amazing front porch, and that's just part of it. Fausto and Irma were Italian, and to talk about this, I wanted to just go into a tiny bit of Italian history. Most people don't realize that the country of Italy, as we know it today, is actually relatively young. It really only developed in the late 1800s, and that was after a period between 1850 and 1870, more or less, called the Risorgimento. And before that, the Italian peninsula was a series of small states and provinces occupied by other powers. And so it was kind of a mishmash of smaller elements. And then over the course of the middle and the late 19th century, these came together, these different groups came together and decided to become the Kingdom of Italy. And so there was a lot of political and economic and social turmoil at that time. And it really actually wasn't until World War II that the current boundaries of the country were settled. But essentially, by around World War I, the country that we know of, Italy, kind of had that shape that we're familiar with. Italian, when we think of Seattle, we think of Ballard and Norwegians and Swedes as being the main immigrant group that came to settle in this area. And Italians were always a very small group, and they still are. And these numbers are just kind of fascinating. In 1860, there were only 11 Italians in Washington Territory, and many of those were Jesuit priests in Eastern Washington. In 1870, there were only 24. And as you know, Washington became a state in 1889. And then very quickly, there came to be an increase in the Italian immigration. What happened was, as all this turmoil was going on in Italy, it just wasn't a great place to live. There had been problems with agriculture on top of the economic and socioeconomic problems that they were having. There were malaria epidemics. There were even earthquakes and all kinds of things that really damaged the country and made it difficult to find work there. So starting around 1870, many Italians went out of the country, and they went to all over the world. They went to Brazil and Argentina, and not so much to the United States, but looking for work. And then they would send money home, and they intended to come back home after they had made some more money. So things got pretty bad, and so by around 1880, no, I'm sorry, by about between 1900 and 1910, there was this huge increase in immigration. And in the year between 1900 and 1914, 110,000 Italian immigrants came to the US per year. And in the specific years of 1906, 07, 13, and 14, there were over 260,000 per year. So it was this huge influx of immigration. Most of them went to the East Coast because it was closer to Italy. And Italians tended to stay together and tended to stay in urban areas. And so it was rarer for Italians to come all the way out to the West Coast. In Seattle, for example, in 1910, there were 3,400 or so Italian-born persons when Seattle had a population of 240,000. And it kind of remained about the same. It declined, the numbers coming in declined due to World War I. And then it settled out in World War II. They were the enemy, so there was less immigration at that time as well. I think those numbers are fascinating. The exception on the West Coast, of course, is San Francisco, where there's a large group of Italians. And when you think of Little Italies, that's really the only one on the West Coast. And when you think of Little Italies, they're more in Providence, Rhode Island, New York, places like that on the East Coast, Philadelphia. So in the Seattle area, if you're familiar with the Italian community in Seattle, you're probably associated with what's sometimes called Garlic Gulch, and that's around Rainier Avenue and Atlantic Street, right about where the I-90 bridge is now, or the I-90 highway turning into the bridge. And that was an area where they settled. I'm actually not sure why that particular location. There were some other groups, other locations where people settled, including Youngstown. This image on the left is a map that was made in 1920, and each dot represents 15 people. So this shows us a good idea of where Italians were living in Seattle. There were some also in Georgetown and in South Park. If you look in those areas, that was partly because of industries that were available in an industrial sector in that area, as well as agricultural land. Interestingly, Italians tended to work as miners. A lot of them came to this area to work in the mines around Issaquah and so forth. And the place is escaping my memory. Not Clay Ellen, but up there, the mines up that near North Bend and so forth. And then the fisheries, but not so much in timber. And a lot of times Italians either worked in industries, factories, or they were the pick and shovel gangs that worked building the streets and the railroads, the street rail that was in the city. In any event, the Scarlet Gulch area became associated with the Italian community, and there were a number of buildings that developed in that area. So Our Lady of Mount Virgin Church, which is still there, was built in 1915, but it served a parish that had been there longer, and it was specifically built. The upper three images you can see. The upper right image is a picture of a very famous church in Florence, Italy, Santa Maria Novella, and it was specifically intended to resemble these kind of Renaissance Florentine churches. The Atlantic Street Center, which is also still there, was built in 1928, but it was established by the Methodist Church in 1910 specifically to accommodate, to help these immigrants that were coming in from Italy that may not have spoken English, that needed help getting settled and so forth. And that facility is still there. Coleman School is where a lot of Italian students came together. And also in the Scarlet Gulch area became associated with food processing, Italian food. So macaroni factories, Borrachini's Bakery was well known, and of course the Oberto sausage company. So, however, the Cettolin House is not there. So one of the interesting things about this this property is that it tells us something about other Italians that were not in the Scarlet Gulch area. And before we get further into the house, I just wanted to clarify where it is. It's in the part of West Seattle that's between Avalon Way and Fauntleroy Avenue, coming off the West Seattle Bridge. It's this little island of just about 2 blocks that you're not even aware of, because it's below Fauntleroy when you're on Fauntleroy, but it's above Avalon when you're on Avalon. And the house, if you look in the left image, the original parcel is what's outlined in yellow. But in the 1990s, the 2 flanking sides of the property, the 2/3 on either side of the middle, were sold off. And so all that we're left with today is the parcel that's shown in red. But keep in mind that the original property was a square, and with the house right in the middle of it. The other thing this map shows is the Nucor steel mill, which had been there since the early 1900s. And that was the reason why Fausto moved here. Fausto built this house. These are some historic images we've got, tax records. These are tax photos from 1937 and 1944. 1937, it shows that the front porch has not even been built yet. And this is the front porch I was telling you about. If you have walked past it, it's this striking, unusual, almost Baroque looking front porch with this crazy arch on the front, and then these elongated arches on the sides, and then all these columns, these kind of fat bulbous columns, and this big staircase going up. The amazing thing about this is that Fausto built this house all by himself, or almost entirely by himself, in his free time. On weekends and he had an unusual working schedule, and so, which I'll talk about more, but he essentially put this together over 13 years. The upper image also shows you the side porch, which is on the lower floor visible in this image, it's actually considered a one-story building with a basement and a sub-basement. But from the back, you'll see that it looks like it's a three-story house. But the family, the Cettolin family, used the side porch really as the main entry to come and go. Fausto, well, let me talk about that in a minute. That was where they came and went. And then here's a picture of how it looks today. So let me talk about Fausto and Irma a little bit. Fausto was born in 1890 in Pianzano, which is a tiny, tiny town at the foot of the Italian Alps, just north of Venice. It's an agricultural area. And he came from a family, he was the oldest of 7 children. Let me make sure I get that right. He was the oldest of 7 children from a large family. As a young man, he apprenticed in Pianzano with a builder and learned plastering skills, and in fact described himself as a plasterer in 1913. In his early 20s, he served in the military and the Italian military, and served in the Italo-Turkish War in 1911 and 1912, which you probably never heard of, but it took place on the north coast of Africa in Libya, and his leg was injured, and fortunately for him, that meant that he didn't have to serve in the military anymore because there was a conscription required. So his military career was finished when he was about 22. And just a few months later, he moved to the United States. But for that experience, he was awarded the silver medal by the King of Italy. Irma, his wife, Irma Dina Monti was her maiden name, was born in 1899 in Livorno, which is also called Leghorn. And they both immigrated. She was the youngest. Let me make sure I'm getting this right, because Irma was the youngest of 10 siblings. In any event, I'm trying to remember, he was the youngest of 10 siblings. Her father was a water carrier for the wealthy families that lived up on a hill, but he died early. And so he was not able to take care of his family. And some of Irma's siblings had already moved to the United States and actually ended up in Seattle. And the ones that were remaining in Italy could not take Irma and her mother in. And so Irma and her mother moved to Seattle, and they immigrated in 1913, and they came out to Seattle. Fausto, however, went to San Mateo, California, which is south of San Francisco, where his brother had already moved to. And so they both made this effort, took trains all the way across to the west, and got established with family members that were already there. Fausto, when he was in San Mateo, worked at a steel mill in the city of South San Francisco, which is out near the airport today, and this enormous steel mill, and its sister mill was in Seattle, what is now the Nucor steel mill. And it's been called several things over time. Bethlehem Steel was what it was called for many years. And so I think so in 1920, Fausto moved out to Seattle, and I think, we don't know, but I think what allowed that was because it was a sister mill, he was able to come out and have a job waiting for him. This photo shows the community of houses above the mill, and that's essentially what Youngtown is. And the way that steel mills work is that once the fire is going and they're melting steel and they're forming it and so forth, they just keep it running. So they have a thing called a triple shift, and there's 3 shifts a day, and you come in and you work your shift and then you leave. And Fausto was one of these people who did that. He was what was called an open hearth boss, which meant that he watched what they were making. And this mill has almost always made rebar for its entire history, and they still do. So maybe you're working the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, or maybe it's the 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. shift or whatever. So and then it would change over week to week, depending on what's going on. So he had this strange free time. It wasn't like a 9-to-5 job with holidays. He had chunks of time that he was able to do this over the course of his career, and he was there for 41 years. Youngstown was essentially a company town, meaning that it was in Bethlehem Steel's interest to take care of their workers. And so sometimes they built houses. There were bars and restaurants that operated 24 hours in this neighborhood. People built their own houses as well, but it's essentially a neighborhood that was going 24 hours a day with this activity, and because all these people lived right nearby it, because you had a shift that might be coming up. So Fausto met Irma at a boarding house. Irma and her mother lived with Irma's brother right down the street. And so they eventually ran into each other in 1920. And in 1920, they got married. And these two images in the upper left are them, I think, at the boarding house. And then the actual wedding photo that they had taken, which I think is so sweet. They bought this they always, their entire life, they lived just within a few blocks, in Seattle. They lived with just in a few blocks of the steel mill, rented apartments. And then finally they bought this property around 1926 or maybe 1929. It's not really clear. The upper right is a picture of looking at the back corner of the property. And you can see that they had neighbors and these kind of the typical wood frame houses that you see all over Seattle, dating from the early 1920s. Actually, those houses were probably built in the teens or the aughts. The lower photo is such a great image. That's Irma, third from the left, and she's holding Virginia. And then Virginia's other 5 siblings around them. So Fausto was a plasterer. That was his job, his experience before he moved to Seattle and worked in a steel mill for the rest of his life. And Virginia had a photo that she showed us, and it's this upper left photo. It's actually 2 photos of this house in Pianzano. And I got on Google Earth or Google Maps and found this house immediately. It's still there on the main road right in Pianzano. And she wasn't sure why he had this photo. And through the course of this experience, my guess is that this was a house that he worked on. And so these photos was essentially a resume that he could show people, this is the kind of work that I do. And in any event, that's my guess. But even if that's not the case, this is a great example of the kind of house you see being built in the suburbs. So if you go to Rome or Milan or someplace, if you go to the outer ring suburbs that are not medieval, but were developed in the 19th century, these are the kinds of houses you see. These are upper middle class and upper class houses, just one after another. And the qualities that make them, obviously it's derived from the classical tradition, but you see things like balusters and columns with Corinthian or Ionic or Doric capitals. You see hip red clay tile roofs. Windows tend to be very stacked, meaning they're right on top of each other. Windows are relatively small, given the wall area. They're typically vertically oriented, and they have these surrounds, these plaster or stone surrounds. There are things like gates, decorative elements, and so in many ways it's familiar to us, but it also looks foreign. I mean, if you walk down the street and saw a house like this, you'd be struck by it. One of the great things that we have, or that the Maryland has at their house, is the mold that Fausto used to create the different columns that you'll see in a minute that decorate the house. And it looks like you can expand. There's a metal element that looks like he could enlarge it to make taller columns, or maybe he was using other molds, but obviously the mold kind of comes apart so that he could build these things. So let's talk about the house now. These are some photos. This is actually not Fausto in the upper left. I think that was his brother-in-law Giuseppe, who lived across the street, by the way. But these are Fausto and Irma's kids, and there's all these great family photos with something architectural going on in the background, but the family right up front and center. So you'll start to see these same qualities in this house. It's a masonry building very well built, very heavy permanent structure. There's a continuous concrete lintel that makes it easier to deal with window openings and door openings, so the lintel height is always the same. You see a hipped red clay tile roof, and then lots of building materials and homemade scaffolding. Here's some more images. I love the image on the left. And that's Fausto. We can see that he's starting to apply the plaster to the brickwork. And then in the right image, by then he's really started to do it. And of course, with stucco and plaster stucco, you can form elements that are decorative, which is what he did. So let's look at the house as it is now. The house is where the red arrow is, and the property goes. So the house that's to the left of it in the upper left image is what used to be their property. And then you can see there's a big tree in the upper right. That's a monkey puzzle tree. That was planted by Fausto, and that's on the neighbor's yard now. So it was quite a large piece of property. And then this is the lower left image is what the house looks like today and how you see it from the street. And most people just think, oh, it's a little one-story cottage, but it's the back side of the house that's to me, so interesting, although that front porch is unbelievable. So in the lower right image, you'll see these concrete columns that Fausto built, and the concrete curbing that the columns sit on top of, and the metal gate. We don't know for sure he actually wrought that iron, but he worked at a steel mill, so maybe he was able to get that, or maybe he was able to work it himself. But Virginia says she never saw him assisted by anyone. He always did this himself, worked on it himself, and it was really kind of his ongoing hobby. Here's some images of the front of the house, and you get a better sense of that front porch with these crazy columns, a very kind of tour de force expression of what a front porch should look like. On the upper right is a period image from the, I think maybe the 60s. But you can see when it was painted differently, it helped bring out these elements that you can see at the corner, what are called quoins, and they look like it's essentially stucco work, stone to appear as stone, but it's stucco. And you can see this the porch in the upper left, the shape of those arches that go over the entablature, and then the steps going up to the front porch. In the upper left, you can get a sense of that very kind of crazy, wavy, Baroque-looking, the side elements that contain the stair. And then the image in the lower left, those putty-colored flower pots are concrete. Those were permanent installations by Fausto, with, of course, real potted plants on top of them. The steps going up are exposed aggregate, very fine aggregate. And you can't really see it very well, but at the very bottom in wire, Fausto, the number 1939 is inscribed, and that's the year he finished the house. But my favorite part of the house is when you do get up to the front porch. The front porch is terrazzo, and we'll see terrazzo throughout the interior of the house as well. Terrazzo is, it says, it's hard to see above, but it says F. Cettolin, Autore, and Autore means author or creator in Italian. So he's saying, this is my work. He's putting his stamp on it. He's very, very proud of it. And I just think that's so special. Terrazzo is you've probably seen it or walked on it. It's an extremely labor-intensive craft. It's essentially colored cement and then colored aggregate that you mix separately, and then you place it on in between. You use wire and metal rills to separate them out. So you shape a design using these metal bands and rills and wires to create a pattern, and then you pour the different cement and aggregate to create a pattern. And then once that's all done, you smooth it and then you polish it. So it's an extremely long process, but the results last forever. here's some other images of the house. So because it's such a steep site, as you move towards the alley at the back, it really drops off. So here's the north or side facade, giving you a sense of how it really starts to have that appearance of the house that we saw in Pianzano. These stacked windows, typically vertically oriented, with these stucco bands between floors, really subtle and beautiful stucco work as the wall meets the roof right up against that. That's not really an eave. It's really just a very tight connection between the overhang of the roof and the wall. And then the stucco banding around the windows. The windows, by the way, all the windows have a transom, or most of the windows have a transom, and where that occurs, there's what we thought was a tulip shape with clear leaded glass forming a tulip shape, a repeating tulip shape. But recently, Marilyn thought it might be a lily, and a lily is the traditional flower of Italy. Here's the other side, the south side, and you can see at the left the side porch that they used to come and go. And here's how it looks today in the upper right with a kind of a high hedge next to it. And these beautiful, very deep, you can see how the windows are set back in the wall, creating this really powerful and a very firm and well-built wall, thick wall. And then at the rear, and I love that the laundry is hanging from the it could be Italy, come on. These images of the windows, again, stacked and kind of moved to the corner. The only change that's really been made was the owners that had the house in the 1990s took out what was the sub basement, the lowest level shown in these photos. There was storage, and then it was also Fausto's workshop at that level, and that's where he was doing all this construction work and mixing concrete and so forth, and kept his supplies. And it looks like a garage, but they actually never owned a car, and so it was just used as a cellar and a wine cellar at that too. So the owner at that time removed those wooden doors and put in sliding glass doors because they renovated that lower level. But here's some more of these great photos, and you can see again that while this was going on, the kids. That's probably my favorite photo. The kids sitting on the side porch. Oh, and so it was the side porch was because it's on a steep slope, and that's the easiest way to get to the steel mill. So that's how Fausto would come and go, because who wants to go all the way up to the street when you don't need to? Because he's going straight, to the first door to the house. So he'd come up the alley, walk up the driveway, and then through the side door, which went directly to the kitchen. And then the upstairs had the bedrooms and sort of a formal sitting room. But most of the living was done on what is the sort of the middle floor. Note also the image on the right, some of the kids, those columns that are behind them are concrete, again, created by Fausto, and those are still there. They're on sort of a curved wall. The porch on the left was enclosed in the 1960s by Fausto and Irma, probably just to make it more, for this weather that we have. I do want to talk really quickly about Italian Renaissance gardens, just because so many elements, whether Fausto intended to or not, appear in his creations. And the two flanking sides of the house were originally gardens, and I'll show you more of that in just a moment. But this will kind of have your eye, keep your eye open for some of these elements. In Italian Renaissance gardens, which predate French gardens like Versailles, Italian Renaissance gardens came first. You'll see things repeated over and over. You'll see very vertical elements occurring. So in the upper left, instead of having just a straight flat baluster, there's these elements that come up, and then there's a pot on top of that. Or at the right, these obelisks that are used to pinpoint specific locations or draw attention to specific locations. At the lower right, there's you can see these same kind of Italian buildings with these vertically oriented, classically derived windows and doors, and hipped roofs, very kind of compact and like almost like a cube or like a perfect geometric form, and also partiered shrubs. And then on the lower left, those walls are actually there's pebble design work, pebble mosaics, and water features throughout. So those are kind of typical elements of these really exuberant Italian Renaissance gardens. So Virginia, very kindly for us, drew a map of what she remembered the house looking like. So this is standing on the sidewalk, looking towards the house. And again, the left and the right sides are gone now. But originally the left side was mostly devoted to vegetables. Again, this is sloping downward towards the alley. Typically grass up near the sidewalk, a hedge along the sidewalk, but mostly vegetables on that side. And we can see grapes and fruit trees, peach trees, cherry trees, chickens, and then an actual vegetable garden. And then on the right side was sort of devoted to leisure and just enjoying a garden, sitting out and having a meal in the garden. And so we see paths and we see flowers, and lilies have a special pride of place right next to the house, right next to the south side of the house. There were multiple terrazzo tables that Fausto built, a barbecue, a pond. He took that big glacial boulder and turned it into a garden element. Unfortunately, almost all of those elements are gone, but the elements that kind of are still in the middle parcel are still there. And here's some period photos of that. So again, we do have the front porch, and we do have this curving, this is the side stair going down to the south side of the house. Fausto sitting on it, again, with these kind of Baroque flared sides to the stair. And also in this lower left image, if you look really carefully, you can see square tiles that are on a sort of a terraced garden, and you can see patterns on the tile. And what Fausto was doing was he was creating these pebblework tiles. He just did this all the time. This was just in his spare time. He would continuously create these elements. Unfortunately, those pieces are gone, but the staircase is still there. And here's that stair today, curving around. You can still see the flared side walls coming around to the side of the house. Really beautiful. So the south garden, he did, this is a great photo of a shrub that he made into topiary, like a bench so that the kids could sit on it. The upper left image, and when you look at it closely, those are actually lilies, and then a very wide variety of flowering plants that must have been spectacular. Fausto, that was just, he loved to garden. That was what he preferred to do in his spare time. The gardens were mostly developed in the 40s through the 60s after he had finished the house. Although Virginia said he really didn't fully finish the house until the mid 40s. And that had to do with things like flooring, installing the hardwood floors and so forth, where there was not terrazzo. So the lower left image is another view of those sort of columnar pieces on the wall that the kids were sitting up against a few photos ago. And then that's what that looks like today at the lower right. So it's amazing that these pieces are still there, these elements. Now, there was an extensive terracing on this side with hedges, and you can see paths, but the terraces were made of either brick walls or concrete walls with stucco cladding. The lower left, well, actually the whole lower images, the lower three images, you can see Irma posing as a scale model for his retaining wall that he's designed. But notice that it's incorporated a seat into it. So it's a wall and it's a seat. So it's a really wonderful piece of work. Oh, in the upper left, you can see the monkey puzzle tree that they planted early on. These are some of the upper left, you can see the big boulder, and the lower left is what he turned it into. He added a pond to it and a fountain. So it became a kind of an element, an element of focus to the garden. This is a terrazzo table. There were several. The middle photo above shows the kind of cool circular bench that went around it with the coved side, and then the table itself. And if you zoom in on the photo, which I did in the lower right, you can see it also says Cettolin on the Cettolin on the table. Again, he was very proud of his work. And they used the yard to entertain and have people over. The interior of the house, again, these are terrazzo floors, so it's colored aggregate held in place by metal little metal pieces, metal wires that are holding it separate and forming designs. When you go in through the front door, there's just a straight hallway with these wonderful pilasters and then this arched element over the, over key locations as you look down. And then at the very back in the lower right is what was the kind of the formal sitting room. And those windows overlook the valley and then Pigeon Point Hill in the distance. So it would have been a really nice view. And then, of course, the steel mill is right down to the left. Today, they use it as a bedroom. But the upper right image also shows you the hardwood floors. And again, Fausto installed all of this. He built all of it. Here's on the upper right is an image of, you get a better sense of these tulip or lily-shaped, clear leaded glass transoms over most of the windows. The windows below were replaced, but with energy efficient ones, but they still match the look and feel. And then the transoms are original. One really cool thing in the upper left is the bathroom on the main floor with where the bedrooms are. And again, he did this plaster piece that over the tub that mimics the front porch, the shape of the arch over the front porch. The kitchen and the dining room also have terrazzo floors, but they also have this sort of compass or star pattern that occurs. So it's a really lovely house. It's actually not especially large, and amazingly, Irma and Fausto raised 6 kids in the house. There were 4 girls in 1 bedroom, about the size of the image that you see there, and 2 boys in the other. Actually, that was the girls' bedroom right there, that photo. Now, so it's an amazing house. So the big picture thing is to think about how unusual this house is. And the immigrant experience for almost all immigrants, I mean, any immigrant, is typically when they go to a country, and certainly to the United States, they really just want to fit in. They don't want to draw attention to themselves. They want they want to do what everyone else is doing. And this was a really interesting thing that the Rainier Valley Historical Society prepared in 2018. They looked at the Italian-American houses in the Garlic Gulch area, where the greatest number of Italian houses were, or Italian families were, rather. And then I actually took a map and I added the map they let me borrow this poster. And these are tax photos showing what the houses look like that the different families lived in. So the Guy family, Guy's Bakery, or the Borghinis, or the Oberto family, all these different families that lived in this area, and they took a picture of the house so that they could see what they look like. And then I went ahead and mapped them on Google Maps, which is that image that you see there. So you can really see that it was a kind of a tight community. Unfortunately, when they started building the floating bridge in the 40s, what eventually became I-90, which was actually a multi-decade process of building that bridge, every time they did it, it kept wiping out what had been the heart of the Italian American community there. And so there's really not much left at all. And when they built I-90, a few decades ago, it really knocked it out. But when you look at these houses, what you see are the same kinds of houses that you see Wallingford and in Finney Ridge and in Green Lake and Ballard and all kinds of places. There are these wood frame, relatively simple houses. A lot of them are from the early 1900s. They're cottages. They're typically Victorian. They were built by other people, and then the Italian family moved in. They didn't. We don't have any examples, or not many that I know of immigrants building their own house. And so the identity of the Italian or any family moving in is just sort of subsumed by the house that is there, so that they move in. One thing, that the example that I've always heard is in Chinatown. When you go to the ID, the Chinatown ID that we have, and you think, oh, there's a Chinese balcony, or there are sort of Chinese decorative elements in some of those buildings. Those were actually designed by established white Caucasian architects that had, that were that did typical buildings all over the city. And then, so they would design their idea of what a Chinese building should look like, or maybe essentially an apartment building with maybe a little bit of a Chinese flair to it. So in our Chinatown ID in Japantown, there's really just a very few buildings that were designed by Asian American architects. So again, just to drive that point home of just wanting to fit in and wanting to do what everyone else does. But the difference here is really that, especially when you go around to look at the back of this house, it's something that he built. It's something that he felt like was a proper home, something made of masonry and brick and concrete that would last a long time for his family, that they could enjoy for the rest of their lives. Something to pass down, instead of, I'm sure he thought, the upper left photo, you can see he's able to look out across the valley and see these little stick-built houses, little wooden houses that, a strong wind could blow down, probably, as far as he was concerned. So, but he built this very strong, powerful, well-built house that is with us today, and it was designated a landmark last year. So we're very excited to have that. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm personally fascinated. I don't see any questions coming in yet, but I'm sure they'll come in now. I know very little about architecture, and you've taught me a lot, and about the history of the immigrants coming to our area.
It's a really interesting story, and especially the communities that are not very well documented. It's not that they're not documented. It's just that so much of the emphasis is placed on other ethnic groups. So it's always good, I think, to have a new thing that we find interesting. I don't know if Marilyn is here tonight in the audience, but I should say that they contacted me to nominate the building, to go through the nomination and designation process. I thought this house was a shoe-in, and it had also been recognized by the state as being a potential meeting landmark criteria, or meeting the National Register criteria. And part of that was done because they were building part of the reason why the owners of the house contacted me was to help protect it in the event that the light rail extension was, going to knock it out. And so the house has been saved for reasons that are actually more complicated than, it's not the Seattle landmark that makes it saved. It's the fact that it was nationally registered. It was eligible on the National Register. And that survey work was done several years ago by other consultants when they were planning the light rail extension. But this helps protect it in perpetuity as a Seattle ordinance to protect it. So Unfortunately, I think my understanding from Maryland is that the path of the light rail is essentially going to go almost right next to it, and it will demolish the houses across the street from it
Hmm.
and cause the house to be a dead end street. I mean, right there, right next to it. So you'll see as the train is going into a tunnel, so it's above ground, but it's sort of in a trench. So that's really unfortunate. So that although the building is and the property is saved, the quality of life for that neighborhood is shot, you know.
David, I'm not sure if you can see the question answers, but I will read them to you. One has already been answered actually when they asked what's the status of the preservation regarding light rail extension, and you did mention that. Um, Next question, is this at risk due to unreinforced masonry?
Uh, well, Virginia was there for the 1949 earthquake, and Fausto died in 1966. I'm sorry, Irma died in 1966 and Fausto died in 1969. So they were there for the 1965 earthquake, so the 49 and 65. And Virginia, Fausto's Virginia said that Fausto said there was not a crack in the house. So it's a very well-built reinforced masonry house.
Wow, we can learn from that, can't we?
Yeah.
Um, and third question is, did Fausto use plans as they assume?
No,
Was
no,
that
no.
the norm, or was the builder, or
No, it
for
was
the
all in his
builder
head.
to draw
He
the
just he
plan?
just did it.
Ah, have we any
And
trace or mention of the plans?
no, there's no plans. And it's interesting when you read the comments on the building permit. He got the permit inspector who went out to the field to make sure he was doing everything right. You know, because you have to do certain things as you're building, and the inspector comes out and gives you the okay to do the next thing. And he red tagged the property because he didn't like the way he was doing some foundation work, and which must have infuriated Fausto because he knew what he was doing. So he had to get another permit and come back, and anyway, it was just kind of funny to read the notes.
It would be interesting if you have more to share about that process, some of the questions and answers and comments and the defense from the neighborhood or something. But before you do, Austin Watson wants to know if you, David, would be able to make the same presentation to the Seattle Architectural Foundation next year.
Sure.
That's an easy one. Go for it, Austin. I don't see any other questions coming in yet, but don't go away. And maybe you could address some of the issues that I was asking about in terms of the battle of, for the neighborhood, of what the neighborhood did or whatever to um, to keep West Seattle Transit, I mean the Sound Transit, from coming that over that area of West Seattle. But well, it is the same area, but just what feet away? What happened?
Dorothy, I wasn't involved in that, so I'm not familiar. I just kind of know what I've read in the paper. Um, I know Marilyn's been very involved in it to protect her house.
Yes.
But I think they, you know, and the way that they determine, I mean, my background is in architecture, so I know a little bit about the process that they have to go through SEPA, a State Environmental Protection Act, and they develop this thing called an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, and they look at all these different potential impacts that each option would create. And so if you go to the Sound Transit website, I'm sure you can find these EIS documents are usually thousands of pages long, but they have to go through and look at every option. And there's typically a preferred option and then 2 or 3 or 4 other ones. And just from a topography standpoint, as I understand it, light rail was extended because of a voter initiative, and so they have to do it to go to from Ballard to West Seattle. I used to work in the junction, so it frightened me that they would want it. I mean, some of the images that they were showing of having this giant 100-foot tall highway in the sky coming right into the junction was disturbing. But the reality is that they have to get over the Duwamish River or under the Duwamish River, which has this extremely high required height, minimum height for a bridge because of the requirement for ship passage up the Duwamish, which is a federal requirement. And then it has to go under, they wanted to tunnel and it ultimately under the junction and go down, California.
Whoa.
And so at some point they have to go from very high to very low and still navigate these different elements. So there were, in the initial review, there were multiple buildings that were considered to be eligible for the National Register, and all of those buildings were protected. Well, protected in the sense that they weren't torn down. It's just unfortunate for Allen and Maryland that the way that the track has been determined at this point, although it's still just ink on paper, nothing's been built, goes right next to their house.
Where does it go? Where is it designed to go from there?
It as I understand it, it's curving to miss Nucor steel. So it goes around Pigeon Point and then curves. Again, this is a high bridge, like a high viaduct. And then it plunges into the side of the hill just west of this house, Marilyn and Ellen's house, kind of as the hill where Fauntleroy is, kind of goes underneath Fauntleroy as it's coming. So it's kind of a complicated section, but I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared to discuss that. I didn't realize it was
they gave opportunities, and you've done a good job of responding to the questions. My last question then is back to the history, all this history. Did that matter a lot in the decision to consider it a historical building? The history of the Italian architecture and so forth?
Yeah, so a landmark in Seattle, to be a designated landmark, it has to meet certain criteria. It has to be associated. There's actually A through F criteria: A, B, C, D, E, and F. It has to have integrity, which means it has to be intact, and it has to look like what it looked like when it was built.
Right.
That essentially, and it has to have qualities that that are associated with something in society or the socioeconomic history of the city, or be an excellent work by an architect, or represent a style of construction that's not around. There's several of these, and so this one was not designated for being associated with the history of Italian Americans. And then also as a really good example of it's actually considered a vernacular building. There is no architectural style with this. It's vernacular because the builder built it without having been an architect. So it's kind of strange, but it's such a unique house. It really, really is. I mean, we don't have, a Norwegian immigrant who built a Norwegian style house, or a Swiss immigrant who built a Swiss style house, or a Cambodian immigrant who built a Cambodian style house. It's the type of residential buildings that we have from the 20s, from 1900 through the middle of the 20th century, all tended to be these kind of set buildings that were either based on historical precedent or other precedents that were developed in the United States. And this house so clearly comes from the mind of Fausto and his where he grew up in northern Italy. So
I love it. Are you still in touch, or are any of his children still in this area?
well, Virginia lives in Blaine, where she's a nun up in
Is
Blaine.
this history, right?
And she has one sister who's alive, but not able to help with the project. So,
Oh,
but we were lucky. It was really remarkable that Alan and Marilyn met Virginia and that they were able to come together and share all this material. So
it's an amazing story that you shared with us. One last question, and then some nice comments are coming in about your presentation and about your presence here, David. Can you think of other examples of buildings in Seattle that are as vernacular? Is this truly a one of a kind?
well, vernacular means that it's it's not designed by an architect.
Right.
So it's built by a builder. So there's lots and lots of vernacular buildings
Oh,
in
okay.
Seattle. But this one is unique because it reflects this Italian heritage that, I mean, it looks like an Italian building. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And a very high level of craftsmanship.
Good. Was Virginia a DoCoMo Dominican nun? They were stationed at Holy Rosary a few blocks away.
I know the convent that she went to was in Tacoma.
Okay.
And she's OP, Sister Mary Cabrini OP. So Order of, is that Providence? I'm not sure.
I don't either.
But so I'm not sure, but we could email her.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, like I said, other thanks are coming in about yours being a very interesting presentation, as you promised, and beautiful. And I personally love the history and what I've learned about his workmanship. I wish there was a way we could continue to thank him personally. But thank you, David. And
Well,
wait a minute. Yes.
well, thank you.
Patrick said it was the order of preachers, Dominicans, that apparently Virginia belonged to.
It still does, I think.
Pardon?
And still does.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes. So again, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, David. We all learned something again, and that's what it was about. And it was local, which is special. We can drive by there, and I'm going to
Okay.
check it out. Thank you, and good night, everybody. See you in January, second Thursday in January.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.